Welcome to It's a Privilege podcast, where we explore the possibilities of our privileges. This is part 2 on the privilege of peace. We highly recommend that you go back to the earlier episodes to get the full perspective on the conversation. On today's episode, our special guest is Lauren Coffaro. She's a Rotary Peace Fellow, and what that means, you'll find out very soon. We also have 2 very special guests. We have Rebecca Force, a brand marketing strategic communications leader, a storyteller, and a wonderful human. And we have Maurice Browne, a previous radio DJ and TV anchor, actor, photographer, and he is my dad. And I have the privilege of having the best dad on the planet. So what can you expect in this episode? First, our crew is going to dive even deeper into the privilege of peace, and then we'll hop into the QAP, questions, answers, and privilege with Lauren to further explore the nuance of peace. We just finished watching Lauren's privileged perspective. Let's see where the conversation takes us. Welcome back, everybody. We just heard from Lauren Coffaro about peace and her brother and her experiences. What are your first thoughts as it relates to our conversation from before?
A couple of times you brought it up also when she was talking about how she wasn't able to enter the mall. It was only available for the elite, that kind of privilege that she experienced. And I think that, many aspects on different levels that we all see that every day. Mm-hmm. Whether you have a privilege of going to a college or you have a privilege of living in a particular type of neighborhood, whether you have a privilege of getting a good what type of education you're able to attain. And I think, this particular case that she brought up, how you're privileged of even entering a mall, of getting what you think should be available to everybody at the same time. And no one probably thought differently about it because you're used to it. And I think that happens across different communities in the U.S., around the world, that you're just used to it and you get kind of complacent to just accepting it. Sometimes you have to, and sometimes you don't.
Okay. Just to point out earlier, you did say that accepting what is reality, that's where peace is. Just pointing out the callback.
What stuck out to me, there were 2 things. That her foundation was laid through mediation on behalf of her brother, and that she has this aura of empathy and wanting other people to understand where someone else might be coming from. I thought that was really powerful. The other thing that immediately, just like a bell went off, ding, 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 when she was saying that she just has this honor of training the next generation of peacemakers. And these students take it very personally. They're on these personal and passionate missions. I'm imagining it's a global group of students, so they're, not just from the US, they're from all over the world. My initial thought was, how can you empower these students to go back to their homelands without power? Like, they have all this knowledge, but then how can they do anything with no power? And then immediately I thought of the greatest peacemakers were not wealthy. Martin Luther King Jr., not wealthy. Malcolm X, though controversial, not wealthy. Gandhi, not wealthy. Like, if you just go down, world leaders, peacemakers and change makers were not wealthy. So I thought they're literally creating another dynamic of power, that people can go back to their home countries now armed with something that will bring them on the same level as the elite, really going through that door and be able to make change. I thought that was really cool.
Initially, when you started that, you mentioned power, and then you mentioned peace. It's almost like that's the power that these kids are receiving to come back
Absolutely.
with. So how is peace power in your mind? Like, you mentioned a few folks who've done some really amazing things around the world and impacted lives around the world, but how is peace power?
Many ways that I don't even know. We've seen examples of it. Peace can be disarming. Peace can be a revolt without hurting anyone. I mean, lunch counter sit-ins, peaceful protests, walks across bridges. These were all done with a peaceful spirit, but they were very powerful and pushed laws to be changed. So peace is powerful in that, like a major element, air and water and fire, it can't be contained. You know what it is, but it can't be contained, and it can actually change the environment.
I have to agree with that 100%. I also look at the reverse, that being peaceful prevents conflicts. If you're able to accept certain things, the reality of your existence, of what's happening in your life, in your community, in your race, in your sex. If you're able to accept that, I think it prevents a conflict, and that is a positive. Some things you can accept, some things you cannot. But if you're able to live with it without causing conflict, I think that is a powerful part of peace.
Well, my parents are the same, I would presume are the same generation that your father is. And there's a duality to their upbringing in that you had to know your place in order to make change. You couldn't go in flipping the table over, you know? I will sit here, I'll get you shot and killed. But if you dressed a certain way and spoke a certain way and kept your eye level at a certain height, there were ways that they did accept the position so that they could get in the door and use peace as a means of defiance to actually make change. So I agree with your father wholeheartedly. That is definitely a tactic for peace and change.
In that example, one has to sometimes accept the thing that is not fair. The ability not to walk into the mall, or even from a civil rights point of view, maybe I'm not allowed to sit on a particular bus seat. If that is the method through which somebody can create peace long term, how does one find peace in the meantime internally when having to sacrifice all the things along the way?
Mm, that's the struggle. That's the struggle of peace. I mean, if we knew the answer to that, we wouldn't have a struggle. We wouldn't have this podcast. I think that's the daily search.
Of the balance between knowing what should be the case, finding a level of acceptance, and then trying to find peace until you are able to receive what you really want in the very end.
It's the long game,
The long game.
for sure. It's the, okay, we'll see.
It's the
You know?
okay.
That's okay, we'll see. I got you. And I'm going to go to work. And I'm going to be on time. And I'm going to dress a certain way. I'm also going to work after hours. I'm also going to get my degree over here. It's a parallel road. Two things can be true at the same time.
And even from her work, Lauren's work, it's like the long play is I need to sit down with these kids who've gone through traumatic experiences, and we have to work through these things, accept the things that have happened, and move forward to find the peace long game. How do we create this for ourselves on a day-to-day basis?
You know, people who weren't rich, who had a movement to go forward. You mentioned Martin Luther King and Malcolm X when he used that as an example, where, you know, both of them had different directions on how to move forward. You can be at peace to an extent. Now, if you're, I think, very forceful, what sometimes it seems to be necessary, that causes conflict, and then you're not at peace. Some people are not at peace until they reach a particular goal, until you have equality, until you have that job. When women can get to be a CEO, can own the company, can get the same pay. When there's more equality, regardless of who you are. Some people are able to accept that and move forward gradually. Some are not. But some people can accept not being at peace. And some people think that not being at peace is what you have to go through in order to get from point A to point B.
I mean, the search for peace may be the fuel. Sometimes you cannot rest, and so you must push until you reach that level of peace. And to answer your question of like, how do we get it? The reason why we don't have an answer for that is why there's such a huge industry, a multi-million-dollar industry for wellness and mental health and all of the things that support this search for peace, whatever that means for a person. Not everyone has the same religious beliefs. I don't like long distance running. That's not how I'm going to find peace. Do you know what I mean? I like to lift my wine glass, but I don't want to lift weights. But somebody else might find peace in the weight room. So I think we are all still searching for this way to make peace, to find peace.
Before we hop into the QAP, the questions, answers, and privilege, any last thoughts about her story, her brother, the moments working with youth, her definition of peace and how to attain it?
Well, Rebecca, you hit it right on the money when she's talking about her brother. I think it was very powerful in how she dealt with it and how the family was dealing with it, especially after she mentioned going to the store and what she had to do and apologize for what he did, but also how she knew what her responsibilities were and how to address the problems.
The other thing that stuck out for me is that she's made a career out of peacemaking. He's training, I think, like many other traits. When someone is calm or a mediator or empathetic, you might think that's just the way they were born, but her stories are a testament to that's a skill she also developed and her parents helped her develop. So I think it's really cool that now she is teaching other young people to develop those same skills. It also made me think I'm really grateful for your podcast because I don't know how many people know about Rotary and that you could get a fellowship to study peace. And I thought that I was like, wow, she's living her life and her life is being financially supported for this mission.
And I think one other comment is that the lack of certain privileges is what disrupts peace. And a lot of folks, a lot of individuals, a lot of countries, a lot of societies are entering a phase where if privilege isn't there, if they don't reach the privilege that others have, that's where you have conflict and that's where you do not have peace.
You said a phrase about these things disrupt peace, as almost as if peace is naturally inherent without these negatives. Is peace our natural default state if you remove money, if you remove power? Is peace that thing that we will all exist in? Or is it still something that we would even have to work for if the playing field were level?
That's a very good question. If all things were equal, there'd be something to fight about.
There you go.
Fair enough. On that note, we're going to hop into the QAP, the questions, answers, and privilege, and let's see if Lauren can answer maybe that question and maybe a few more, and we'll be right back. Welcome back, everybody. I have the privilege of hanging out with this wonderful human. She's a Rotary Peace Fellow. She's managed international cultural diplomacy programs. She's an adventurer. She likes to scuba. And she travels the world with like a childlike curiosity. But most importantly, she's the interim executive director of PeaceJam. It's a foundation whose mission is to support and create young leaders committed to positive change through the inspiration of Nobel Peace Laureates. It's intense and beautiful. Please welcome the wonderfully peaceful Lauren Coffaro. It's a privilege to have you on the show, Lauren.
It's a privilege to be here with you, Jason.
Every day might be different, but today, what are 3 privileges that you're feeling today?
I am feeling the beautiful support of my life partner today. Also, a lot of gratitude for this tech setup and this space that's allowing me to connect with you. And also my community here in Denver, something I am really grateful to have after the pandemic and a lot of times of isolation, and really cool folks also working here on social impact.
So you are a peace fellow, so you know all about peace. So how do you actually define peace, and how has it evolved over time?
That's such an interesting question, because when you ask people to define peace, everyone has a very different answer. And I think what I've taken away is people often think peace is a very like light and fluffy thing. Like peace is a feeling of serenity or like a cloud, meditation.
Yeah.
And it is those things. But I think peace is radical. And peace is something that everyone wants, but not many people can define. I would define peace as the presence of social justice and the conditions for dignified life for all human beings. I also define it personally as nonviolence, or the absence of violence, or physical war, physical violence.
So you mentioned a word that many people often put right next to peace, which is war. Like, I want to dig into this. What is the difference between those two? And because you spoke in your story about how giving people dignity and making sure that they're being seen as whole, how does that get into this equation of like war versus peace?
Absolutely the backbone of pursuing peace. And you can't have peace unless you end war. So war being any kind of physical violence, or we call it, like in the theory, the peace building theory, direct violence. Also cultural violence, like social violence. There's all these different kinds of violence. You do have to end violence in order to pursue peace. You can't have a just society, freedom, access to education, and conditions for dignity if your life is under threat, right? Or if there's gunfire at your door. But I think of it as two steps, important steps, or maybe like two sides of a coin. There are a lot of people who are really devoted to ending war, ceasefire, the idea of what does our world look like if we end war. And that's critical. And there's a whole other component to peace building, which is development, education, access to resources. I mean, if you think about it, if you are living in a conflict zone and the conflict ends, you're still going to have enormous needs that are going to be met. You're not going to feel necessarily peaceful in yourself. You may still have a lot of insecurities, food insecurity, lack of access to education, and inequalities that you're facing. So there's this whole kind of unseen, like invisible component to peace, which is all of the, pursuit of social justice that is critical to building peace, but often like left out of the conversation.
So often, at least in circles that I see and on the news, like you said, the tendency when you don't have peace is to be like, sign a treaty, stop shooting, da 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 da. Like you jump to the ending of like the violence portion. Should our perspective change? Should our energy to ending conflict move away from like ceasefire, let's get Taylor Swift to tell them this, you sign a treaty, versus like, is there something else we should be doing instead of just asking from afar to sign a treaty and stop shooting each other?
Yeah, the treaties, ceasefire, that is a critical component of peace building. Sure. I think peace is absolutely tied up in development. It's absolutely tied up in the pursuit of equality. It's absolutely tied up in education and distribution of resources, even in cultural heritage and being able to express yourself through family, religion, through different aspects of society. My message is that peace goes so far beyond just ending wars. And there's things that people can do from their place in society. Every single kind of sector of our society has a piece of the peace building puzzle.
The piece of the peace building puzzle.
Maybe I'll give an example.
Yeah, please do.
There's a tool that I think is really useful for understanding peace. And there's an organization called the Institute for Economics and Peace. They put out an index or like a ranking of most peaceful countries, but they have one that's called the Positive Peace Index. That really breaks down, when you look at that, what are the components of a peaceful society from that holistic sense that I talked about, right? What does it look like when you have positive peace? And something that's really interesting, actually, the US is not as high up on that list as you might expect. I think right now it's sitting at maybe 26 on the list. And, some of the components, for example, the US ranks really high on sound business environment.
Business environment is part of peace.
Yes. Being able to have your own business or pursue economic mobility, like that's part of having a peaceful society from the holistic sense. One area where the US ranks very low is good relations with neighbors. And that's not talking about Canada or Mexico. That's talking about internally, relations between ethnic and cultural groups, right? And that's people who live here is pretty obvious that that's a place where the US really struggles. And that's something that is a component of a peaceful society too.
So what are we good at then? If the U.S. is not very good at peace in general, what is one of the things we're like, okay, there's this little glimmer of hope that we do well. Like, what do we do well? Anything?
Capitalism.
So the U.S. struggles to create peace in all the ways that you spoke about in a holistic sense. And with all these levels to it, it's beginning to seem like peace is super complicated, which obviously it is. So let's simplify this for a moment. Is peace possible in your mind? Like when I was a kid, everyone was like, well, peace, let's hold hands and sing songs. And Michael Jackson came out with like, heal the world. Like everybody was vibing out. And like today, after you've seen all this, is peace possible? And if not in the tradition, in the old school sense, what does peace look like going forward for you?
That's like the pageant queens when they're always asked what they want for the world. World peace.
Yeah, world peace, right.
That's a complicated question, and I think I have a complicated answer too.
Yeah, sure.
Is that peace in terms of like a dignified life in our lifetime? And I don't think it's probable. But there's different levels of peace too. There's inner peace, there's peace in a home, peace in country, in the world. And I think in the pursuit of peace in our lives, in our lifetime, improvement is possible. Like pockets of peace are possible. In my work with PeaceJam, when we work with young people, often they're facing conflicts in their homes or in their schools. They're trying to confront bullying, or they're trying to confront issues they're having in their relationship with their parents. And it is possible with the right tools and with an understanding how to relate to people, how to create change or transformation. It's possible to resolve those things. So I feel optimistic that there's many possibilities within our lifetime, and especially in educating the next generation. I feel this optimism. There's opportunities to have a more peaceful existence. I do think that world peace is going to be a lifelong work for all of us.
How many factors are on this list? The U.S. is ranked 26, and I'm sure people are going to be like, we should be higher than that. But like, what else? How many factors are on there?
So there's 8 different pillars that they use to measure positive peace. And then they rank all the countries in the world. So 20 isn't that bad when there's, almost 200 countries in the world. But yeah, probably not what people would think.
Okay. So there's 8. So having those 8 categories gives you a better chance of having peace in whatever country that you're in. But I guess I'm curious, by not having them, does that increase the chance of violent conflict?
Yes, definitely. I mean, the pillars of building peace are what makes a society resilient and what makes you able to prevent conflict. One of those pillars, for example, is low levels of corruption. If you have high levels of corruption, then your propensity to have greater conflict or move into war when different situations arise definitely is higher.
In your story, you at least alluded to this idea that more understanding helps to create peace. There's a certain level of I have to understand you and you understand me. You did that when you were in situations with not only your students, but with your brother, and throughout life. It seems to be a very common theme. Now, when we're dealing with current events, Gaza, Ukraine, other very difficult moments around the world, all of these things can be deeply polarizing and personal. So how can you create a conversation or create the moments to understand when you can't? It's very difficult to even open your mouth without somebody turning around and being like, nope, I'm not going to do it. How do you create that understanding in that kind of situation?
Peace building takes definitely a high level of, self-awareness of your own positionality in the world, your own biases. And I think that understanding yourself and where you're coming from into a situation, and especially those biases that may even be ingrained in you from where you grew up and you're less aware of, that's a great place to start in order to come to these kind of conversations with an open mind and a self-awareness that lends itself to being able to have a dialogue. I think the other piece of it is humility. Peace work takes a great deal of humility, of listening, of seeking to truly understand others. And when you're dealing with these kind of protracted conflicts that are deeply embedded in people's identities, you're not always going to be able to have a productive dialogue with them. But I believe if you come at conversations from a place of genuinely seeking to understand and care and compassion for other humans, that's where you have the best chance to make progress.
Sure, that takes a lot of emotional intelligence. That there's a very high level emotional cognitive places that a lot of us aren't even in, especially if you don't have coffee in the morning, right? There's a bunch of who we are in that space. Let's assume that we have the ability to operate there, but we have folks in our communities that may need a place, an environment, a safe space to be able to get to that point. How do you create that environment to allow folks who might not be able to get there yet to want to share, to be open enough, to be vulnerable enough to have those kind of conversations?
I feel like the question you're asking, like the answer to that is the key to transforming the world.
Fair enough.
You know,
Today, though, if you had to tackle it, how would you go about it?
In the work I do with young people, we create spaces where young people want to show up because they want to meet other people, because they want to seek inspiration, because they know there's a problem and they don't know where to start to tackle it. And they come to the space for different reasons. A lot of them don't necessarily believe that they can make a difference or that they can build peace. A lot of them don't have much peace within themselves, right? They're struggling with that inner peace. Creating a space where you facilitate, starting with, again, that process of self-reflection, understanding who I am, what do I care about, why, what do I want to see changed in the world? Like, facilitating that process is that first step to what I just talked about, right? To having that level of self-awareness that allows you to actually open a productive dialogue with other people. And so sometimes you just got to start with, the square one, like, how am I addressing what's going on inside myself in my own life before looking to solve all of the problems in the world.
Which sounds very individual. Peace is one of those things that's difficult. And this is, I don't know if there's a question here more so than just like a thought. It makes a lot of sense too. You have to ground yourself to be able to create the other additional spaces that are needed for other people to be able to ground themselves and be vulnerable too. Like, it's this chain reaction. And it's incredibly frustrating that it starts so singularly. It's like, with all the things that are happening around the world and as many people are being impacted by what's there, I believe you're 100% right, but it's also super frustrating to think like start with you and build out and find other people who want to do that too and continue doing it. It's slow. Yeah. I guess my problem is that it seems so slow, and when it's like and the dominoes just go doot.
Yes.
Dude, as opposed to like a snow avalanche effect.
I see that. It is frustrating because these problems are urgent. There is death happening in the world. There's war happening in the world that urgently needs to be solved. And so there is a tension there. I recently was in a conversation with Jody Williams, who's one of the laureates who works with PeaceJam. She led the international campaign to ban landmines. And a young person asked her, like, to ban
landmines.
Yeah, to ban landmines. It was the only successful campaign to ban a weapon globally.
Really?
So very amazing. And a young person asked her, how do you grapple with the fact that there's so much suffering going on in the world and so many of these urgent issues that need to be solved? Yet you have to live your life and you have to work on yourself and find moments of peace in your own life. That's a struggle that a lot of our young people are feeling too. Like, there's a conflict between that urgent activism that needs to happen and being able to prepare yourself and sustain yourself in this work.
I'm still that way.
Yeah.
I relate to that too. Yeah.
And what she said was, my activism is for me too, because I want the world I live in to be a better place for me. So it's as much for other people as it is for ourselves and our lives. And I think recognizing that duality, there is a tension there. It's part of the process.
How many Peace Laureates do you work with? Have you worked with?
14.
That's pretty awesome. Give me one more story. So this, the one that you just spoke to, ban landmines. What's one other cool thing that another Peace Laureate that you did, that you work with?
So I work with Lama Bowie, who is from Liberia in West Africa. And she brought together Muslim and Christian women in the civil war in Liberia. And that was a horrendous civil war, like child soldiers, huge amounts of death. And she brought together Muslim and Christian women, and they would sit in the central square of Monrovia in Liberia and demand peace and say, we, the women, don't want this. We're half of the population, and more if you take all the children, and we want peace. And that movement spread across all of West Africa, and they got the men to put down their arms. And she now does women's and girls' education and gives scholarships to girls in Liberia, and does a ton of work to support with the development of the country. And she's so amazing with the kids. Like, she can relate to them on such a personal level that just really inspires them to confront the problems that they face in their lives too.
And I love the fact that that's the snowball effect. That's the dominoes, all of them falling in a direction to create real change. It doesn't happen all the time, but that's why she's a peace laureate. She's a Nobel laureate. As we wrap up here on the podcast, we like to define and think about the possibilities of privilege by doing 3 things. 1, know your privileges. 2, use your privileges to help yourself, kind of close to what you were just talking about. And 3, use your privileges to help others, also what you were just talking about. So after this podcast, how are you going to tackle those 3 things?
So in my work with peace education with young people, we're teaching young people to know themselves, know their own power and privilege, and then identify the places in the world very similar to what you shared, where they can use their unique skills and their unique passions to make a difference and uplift others. And that's something that I have to constantly remind myself within my work and within my daily life, like to apply to myself, to always sit down and think about when I go into a conversation, when I go into a new project, what's my best way to use my unique skills or my unique position in the world to affect change or to be successful in this way? And who do I need, right? Always looking for the local partners, expertise, people who are already doing work in this area who I can bring in, because that's where the innovation happens. Like, that's where I think personally I can make the most impact, is working in partnership with people who complement what I'm bringing to the table. And so I think those are 3 questions I'd like to ask myself every day.
And that response is probably the best answer of them all that we've had so far on the show. Lauren, thank you so very much for being here. It's been a privilege to hang out with you. Before you go, is there anything that you want to share, get people involved in? Is there anything that you want to promote at all?
I would love if everyone who listens to this podcast could take some time to think about what a peaceful world looks like to them, because then we can start to build it.
Lauren, it has been a privilege to have you on the show. Thank you so very much.
Thank you. It's been my privilege to be in this conversation with you.
Welcome back, everybody. It's a privilege. A lot of great nuggets of inspiration. I know I found a piece of inspiration in there. Yeah. No? Okay. What are your thoughts? What are your thoughts about some of the things that we chatted about? How does that evolve our conversation about peace for you?
One thing that stuck out to me is that this next generation of peacemakers, they're young. She kept talking about their age and how they're figuring out life for themselves, but also this is their mission in life. And I thought there's a strategy in that. Like she was saying, peace is layered. It's got a long-term strategy. There's some thinking in there, and it's great that they're targeting these young people before major heartbreak and pivots. And there's a lot more hope and drive and frankly energy in the younger group. That's what stuck out to me from what she was just sharing. Yeah.
When she mentioned that peace has to begin with yourself, that you have to have inner peace before you can move forward, I think that you have a lot of forces outside of yourself which promotes anti-peace. And that's something that you have to be aware of. And sometimes it controls you. You have influences that direct you. Well, this is what you have to do. And it's counterproductive, but you have to have inner peace first in order to have peace with yourself and to promote peace elsewhere.
I like this concept of like this anti-peace. It's not war, it's anti-peace.
Yes.
And I think that's a unique way of thinking about the areas of our lives, whether that's externally or internally, that impact how we treat peace. So what is an aspect of anti-peace in your mind?
Really, what came to my mind, the first thing is I was rushing one day, and I have a routine, and I feel like we all have our sensory routines, right? We know where we put our keys. Our bag is here. We do the same routine when we leave the door, we get in our car. You know where you're going in terms of your commute. And so I was just on automatic, and I pushed all the buttons, the garage door, open the car door, sat down, plug in my phone, give my daughter her juice. Like I'm doing it. And I'm backing up, and I just hear a scraping sound. I thought that's not part of the routine for the morning. What's going on? I didn't actually push the garage door all the way, and I didn't time the waiting. So the garage door opened half the way, and I backed out, and I scraped the fin off the top of my SUV. Oh, it's heartbreaking.
Expensive.
And it's expensive for sure. So I don't have Sirius XM right now. That's okay. It's the least of my worries for sure. But the anti-peace in my world, and I feel this for all my friends, all my mom friends, is that when there's a wrench in your daily routine, there's already so much going on, and mental load and planning and working and balancing the checkbook and everything, that when you scrape your car or hit a pothole or anything happens, it feels like a personal attack. You ever been driving and you think, is everyone driving at my car today? Like, what's going on? And that's, to me, those are those moments in your daily life of anti-peace in the bubbles we create for ourselves.
The one thing that I'm picking up from your description is that what you described is a situation that some Americans can relate to. This idea of having a car, kids, routine, scraping car. My day is now shot.
Yeah.
Any peace that I just had is completely squashed. Like
Mhm.
nothing internal. It's all like, who wants some next?
Right.
Right?
Yes.
I get that. But if you were to expand that out to not just a single person, but like to a group of people,
Mm-hmm.
a group of people that may be struggling or working super hard for a while, and one
Mhm.
small thing, just
Mhm.
timed slightly different, changes the whole mood of a group of people from being on a regular path to a path of being like anti-peace.
Yes.
And when you think about it on like these larger and larger scales, when we see some of these conflicts around the world, it could just be this metaphorical garage door just went up a little too slow one day. It may not be as aggressive as like what you were saying earlier, Dad, is like, I want power. It could just be like something happens to a group serendipitously that really causes a shift in perspective. And that could be the snowball effect, which is really frustrating because it's like you do all this work, you put all this work in, and the garage door is the thing. That's the thing that stops me from having peace. So I don't know where I'm going with this.
Right.
Aside from the fact like there's a garage door that I'm apparently mad at.
mean,
right.
It happens in major cities, right? I mean, the L train is now shut down.
Yeah.
The door is open. Hundreds of people spill out.
Yeah.
And if you could follow each one of those hundreds of people to see how that one train schedule has affected their whole day, you're going to see a lot of anti-peace.
So in those moments, Dad, when you have this metaphorical garage door that doesn't open and you back into it and scrape your car and now really expensive and you're really mad at the world, how do you find peace for yourself and for those around you in those moments?
Well, I try to look at it from a little different way. I look at it as I expect anti-peace along the way, and I consider it a privilege not for it to happen.
Okay.
So when
I
it
like
does,
it. I
it's
like it.
part of the routine. So I look at somebody, either the trash can falls over and the trash is all over the street when you're putting it out. You have to pick it all back up again. Lawnmower doesn't start. It's something. The cat misses the litter box. Okay. So I look at the unexpected. I expect that. And that way I'm prepared for it and I'm not really disappointed and I can deal with it. Most people expect peace throughout the day. When you start the day, I don't. I expect the unexpected. I expect that anti-peace. And if it doesn't happen, There you go.
We're like yin and yang. Yeah, I like it.
I really like that approach of being like, you know, I plan for the worst, and when the best happens, then that's good. It's a really, not everyone can be happy and live with that perspective, a more pessimistic perspective, but I see the value in it for sure.
I expect the computer doesn't start right, the program doesn't work, the power goes out. I expect that, and when it doesn't happen,
you almost make it sound like you don't ever get to a point where you don't feel the anti-peace, and I feel like that's not true.
No, there's a level.
Okay, right? So talked about that level then. Like if that level happens, what do they?
What I don't expect is somebody to ram into the car while I'm driving. Okay, that goes over that little threshold of trying to maintain peace.
So when you go over that threshold, how do you come back? Yes, how do you come back still?
You just have to accept this is part of life.
How do you accept it? You keep saying you accept it, but I find it hard to believe that you're just like, that's it, and then you go about your day. Like, what else is part of that process for you?
No, there's a couple of rules in life that have helped me since I was a little kid all the way up to where I am today. One is not to benefit from somebody else, a disadvantage. Some people do that. Somebody loses the job. So you just don't take advantage of a situation at somebody else's expense. That's one major rule that I have. But if you get to a point where you have a traumatic event, I've always, because of things that have happened in my life, I automatically get into a mode, you get really depressed, and then you have to get yourself out of it. And I do it pretty quickly, usually. I don't look at what I don't have. I know everybody says it. I try to look at what I do have. Okay, this happened. So what do I do to move forward? That sounds pretty easy, but I center myself on doing that. I don't know if that answers your question.
No, but I think that it does. That is your mechanism. That's how you ground yourself, is to focus on the things that you do have. If all the wine glasses in my cupboard broke and there's one left standing, I have one glass that's standing. And you trained yourself, you worked with yourself, and you figured out a way to coach yourself to do that. And that's what Lauren's doing with youth on a wider perspective, it sounds like, of being like, okay, when the garage door doesn't open and all the wine glasses break, there's one left.
That was very first world.
Right. It's very first. It's very first world.
Yes.
Right.
Yes.
I don't think there's anything wrong with using that as the reference point for our conversation to address the ways that we not only cope, but we deal with anti-peace in a productive way. And I'm hoping that, like, the youth that she works with, maybe they're not wine glasses, Rebecca. Maybe they're not wine glasses, okay? But whatever the thing is that they're faced with. She said the kids survived the trauma of some shootings. She mentioned that. Which is way different than a wine glass. Way different than a garage door.
And I don't want to be misleading, but I'm just saying, I don't want to trivialize what they're going through either.
Right. I don't want to trivialize what they're going through either. However, the disruption of peace for an individual or a group of people, it doesn't have to be a bullet to cause disruption. It can be something simple. And that is what I'm getting from this conversation. It's like both can impact the way that we approach peace.
100. I mean, in our school district now, especially with the middle school age kids, the anti-peace is bullying. We've had a child, not even in high school, and a middle school student take their own life. So not only was she experiencing anti-peace externally with bullying, but internally to just not be able to take it anymore. There's so many layers. Like she said, I mean, like Lauren said, there's just so many layers to peace and to anti-peace.
Lauren is extending her resilience to anti-peace and training other folks to deal with that and coaching leaders to create peace in other places. What do you two think that we can do as human beings, as individuals? What can we do to share that with others throughout our day? So, Dad, your level for anti-peace is fairly high. You expect bad things to happen. Like, you're good for most of the time. So how do you share that skill with others?
It's a good question. Simply, you just have to persuade others for a consensus to move forward in one direction. That is the beginning of a communal type of peace, where as a group, more than just the individual, others are moving in the same direction. You have to convince others that you can't do it by yourself. You have to gradually get a consensus for others to agree on something. And that's the major problem. Everybody has a different perspective, so it's hard to get that agreement collectively. And so you have splinter groups, and they branch out, and then they have conflicts with each other. So you have to make some sort of compromises. And if you have the compromises within the group, then you can move forward. But you do have to have some sort of consensus of how you want to go forward.
To build off of that consensus often comes from a tragedy when we're talking about peace movements on a global scale. Even here, county-wise in Pennsylvania, when, and please correct me if I say his name incorrectly, Osaze was killed by the police. It completely activated a group fighting for not only justice, but peace and a relationship healed between the police here and the residents of Center County.
In many of the examples that we are finding, it almost sounds like conflict is necessary. Anti-peace is necessary for us to come together to find peace as a whole.
Absolutely. Lauren even said it herself, that there cannot be peace without war. They go together.
They go together, but I did not hear that one was the prerequisite for the other.
Let's roll the tape back.
Well, we actually didn't do that, so we don't know. We're just going to roll the conversation. Yeah, so that's what just happened. Yeah, just well, you judge for yourself. You leave comments in the comments section. What is the prerequisite before the other? I don't know.
I know what I saw.
Dad, what did you hear?
I did not hear that it was a prerequisite, but that is probably true.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay, fine. I just wanted to comment that I didn't hear come from Lauren. You know what I mean? I'm just saying.
It's just a simple push of a button.
No, we're not going back. No, we're not going. No,
okay.
Can't go back.
Okay.
No,
right,
moving forward.
Sure,
but y'all can go back though. Y'all can go back. Maybe that's where we ended. Is peace possible without initial conflict? And the other question I want to ask is, if everything else were equal, is peace our natural state? I still am not so certain.
No.
My dad, now it's a definitive no.
I think if all things were equal, we joked about it, but at least in the mental state of humanity as it stands right now, you have to have something to instigate you to move forward. And if everything's equal, there's going to be conflict somewhere. Somebody doesn't like your hair, your clothes. Somebody doesn't like something. There'll be something to combat. Something you're going to disagree with. Always.
All right, Dad, those are your final thoughts for the show. Yes. Rebecca, last final thoughts on peace before we head on out?
That's so hard. He's talking about conflict. I'm thinking about children. As a parent, I'm thinking about a sandbox. And these children aren't taught to not like each other. My daughter goes to, basically, we joke around, it's like baby UN in that school. And yet they get along, but they also argue. And Logan's favorite thing to tell me is, I was line leader today. So there's even positioning for leadership at the age of 4. My final thoughts are not to sound like a Whitney Houston song, but, the younger generation is our future. I'm glad there's people like Lauren who are training people who have not been swayed or become cynics to be change makers and advocates. I hope for more people like Lauren and more people like the people she is teaching.
I would like my final comments to be that privilege will always exist. And it's the level that you are able to accept it that'll bring you peace.
Of course, my father ends on like a very quotable thing. That's what my father does. Like, okay, did you write that down? Is that written somewhere on the wall? Anyway, everybody, we'll see you in the comment section. And that's where we're going to end it for part 2 on the privilege of peace. What questions emerged for you? What ideas were challenged? What emotions came up during those conversations? Feel free to go to our social media at PrivilegePod on all platforms and share your thoughts and let us know your thoughts so we can continue the conversation about privilege and about peace, because the world needs it so much right now. Thank you for listening. Thank you for sharing. And of course, it's a privilege.